Let's add a few more details about what happens to carbon in the ocean. So we looked at the global carbon cycle picture before. We mentioned some ocean components in terms of the surface ocean, DIC, deeper intermediate ocean, the exchanges and reservoirs at various places, various depths of the ocean. But the ocean is quite a bit more complicated because it's a 3D fluid medium that carries life, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and iron, nitrogen, and many things up and down, and this is going to be split into the physical circulation of the carbon. So there are places where cold waters come up and bring up CO2 from deeper in the ocean, and there are places where water sinks and CO2 is going into the ocean. CO2 is being moved from one place to another, and so on. This is called the solubility pump because, as we said, the solubility of gases in a fluid depends on temperature and also pressure. This is why we keep the Coke can sealed and cold, right? So you can imagine that the ocean, as you go deeper, the pressure increases. So each 10 meters or so, it adds another atmospheric pressure, 14.5 square pounds per square inch of pressure. So it gets very high pressure as you go deeper, and temperatures get colder, so more and more CO2 can be held as you go deeper in the ocean. So when the waters move up and down, this soluble dissolved CO2 and other CO3 minus are moved around. So we call that the solubility flux pump. But if you look at in general, you have CO2 uptake that we talked about. There is photosynthesis happening and phytoplankton are being produced. Let's say large phytoplankton, small phytoplankton. So that's carbon uptake that we looked at before. We said 90 gigaton carbon going in and 90 gigaton carbon coming out, with a small difference that amounts to a net uptake or outgassing. So those are eaten by zooplankton, and small phytoplankton are eaten by microzooplankton, and they are eaten by small fish, and zooplankton can go up and down, and they are dead, and all kinds of detritus forms because the fish that eat them are also spitting out, leaving behind some dead organic matter. There is aggregates being formed which can sink and take organic carbon deep into the ocean and bury it deep in the bottom of the ocean. So you can imagine that species that are forming calcium carbonate shells that we will see in a minute are sinking to the bottom and are getting buried under pressure and temperature. They are getting metamorphized into limestones, and with tectonic movement they are getting exposed. So you get mountains of limestone like the Dover Cliffs in the UK and so on. And there are along the depth of the ocean, detritus is being consumed by bacteria. On the bottom there are benthic zone animals and so on that are living there. There are reactive sediments, so on and so forth. So barely 1% or less of the organic matter that's produced here makes it to the bottom, but it's still critical because once it gets away from the recycling process, it can stay buried for a long time, which is what gives us these massive reservoirs of carbon deeper in the ocean that we saw before, right? So the residence time is long. So here we are again with deep ocean at 3,700 meters, twilight zone where there is some diffuse light but not enough for photosynthesis, approximately from 100 meters to a kilometer. So that's also known as the mesopelagic or middle zone of the ocean. The surface ocean in the top 100 meter or so is known as the euphoric zone, which means there is enough light for photosynthesis. So if nutrients are available, carbon is available, and light is available, then photosynthesis happens. Of course, there is respiration and outgassing not only of CO2, but ocean species also produce dimethyl sulfide, nitrous oxide, methane, and so on and so forth. And there is predation by birds and species. There is pathogens, pollutants, and nutrients coming from land onto the ocean. There is deep water formation where water sinks and takes CO2 down. There are ventilation regions where water from below the surface gets to be lifted up and sees the surface and then goes back down, takes with it the things like CO2, or it brings up CO2 from depth. There are fluxes of nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, and silica, which are the basic nutrients needed needed for photosynthesis, as well as species to build their skeletons, teeth, bones, and other things. Decomposition, archaea are another kind of ancient bacteria that also do a lot of the conversion of organic matter back into what are called reformed nutrients. So nitrogen, phosphorus, silica, etc. have to be reproduced by converting these organic matter back into inorganic nutrients and so on. Okay, so there is carbon and nutrient flow in these yellow arrows. There is a microbial loop in these lot of white arrows shown here, all these stuff, and there is physical mixing happening here between the surface layer and the subsurface layer. So various time scales are involved. The water to get mixed back up here takes hundreds to thousands of years. The waters here are mixed on weekly, monthly, yearly time scale. Waters are moved around on weekly, monthly, yearly, decadal time scales, depending on whether you are just going across the equator or from the equator to the subtropics, or subtropics to the high latitudes, and so on and so forth. So you get a sense that carbon has many forms, and they are organic forms and inorganic forms, and they are moved by the biology, which is the biological pump. So this is the biological pump here in terms of moving organic matter down and bringing back up, or the up and down movement of the zooplankton or detritus and so on. And the solubility pump is this physical mixing and advection by upwelling and downwelling and so on that we talked about. Okay, so this gives us a chance to then, using some complicated, complex, sophisticated, accurate methods, to estimate anthropogenic invasion of carbon. So since the Industrial Revolution, CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing, and it is going down deeper into the ocean in special places. I had mentioned this place as special, where we look at the deep water formation. There are reasons why water here gets dense at the surface and sinks. Sorry, I cut off the scale here. It's moles per meter cube, I think, going from 0 to 160 or so. And you can see that that's where the anthropogenic CO2 has gone down, and there is a lot of it when you average, and there are other places where there is a lot of mixing happening, and there are places where water is coming up, so the anthropogenic CO2 cannot go in directly, it can only come back indirectly. So there is upwelling here, much stronger upwelling here, not much carbon going in here. There are waters converging in these places and going down below the surface, so there are places where anthropogenic carbon is going in, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that is a complicated method to do that, so I'm not giving you any details. Essentially, there is always CO2 in the ocean, DIC, dissolved inorganic carbon in the ocean, but we have to find a way to track what is the new anthropogenic carbon that is coming in on top of what naturally exists. So there are ways to calculate those. You can see this paper or nice papers and books by Nicky Gruber, Sarmiento, and Follows, and so on and so forth. So this is now showing the latitude depth sections of anthropogenic carbon in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. So you can see that this is the Atlantic Ocean. It's going from I hope, let's see, should be north to south. So yes, north to south. So you have where deep water is sinking, you can see that the anthropogenic CO2 in micromoles per kilogram is going deeper, and where there is upwelling, there is not it's not going much deeper. In the subtropical gyres where the waters converge and go down, you again get invasion of anthropogenic CO2. This is the Atlantic Ocean here, so the section is along this line, and this is the Pacific Ocean, which doesn't have any real deep water formation, so it's mostly the subtropical gyres where the anthropogenic invasion is happening, and there is strong upwelling in the deep tropics, so you can see the CO2 from the surface doesn't go as deep. Here it's down to 1500 meters, here it's less than or equal to 500 meters. Indian Ocean is unique because it's cut off to the north, so water is going from the south to the north and coming back out. So this section is along this red line here. So deep in the south where there is subtropical gyre, again you see the invasion of anthropogenic CO2. Here there is not much anthropogenic CO2 invasion happening. Okay, so I will leave it at that kind of depth, but to add to the acidification, species like coccolithophores, which form calcium carbonate shells, foraminifera, which can be benthic or pelagic, or corals, and these are some kind of theropods, they all form calcium carbonate shells. So when there is acidification, these cannot form their shells at all. Okay, so I will leave that ocean part here and then come back and look at it a bit more detail at the carbon cycle that we looked at before, again averaged over the last decade or so. So we'll look at the fluxes one more time just to re-emphasize the concept. So this is kind of a very brief introduction to carbon cycle. I must repeat that there are lots and lots and lots of details, but you can follow the details in my carbon cycle course or elsewhere if you are more specifically interested in the details of the carbon cycle. Okay?